Of course, Donald Trump, it looks to me like he may have started World War III. And I say that with no glee whatsoever and considerable concern. Fill up your gas tank. This is extraordinarily dangerous. Iran is the 7th largest supplier of oil in the world. It is they have the 8th largest official army in the world. And then they have paramilitary forces both in Iran and around Iran, in Syria and in Lebanon. You add those together, it may well be that Iran has the 4th or 5th largest military in the world. This is a major country. Iran is several times the size of Iraq geographically and I believe larger than most European countries in terms of population. And Donald Trump has just gone off the rails here. And I'm of the opinion, and I don't know, maybe I'm wrong on this, but it makes perfect sense to me that Donald Trump is doing right now what he back in 2011 and 2012 was predicting that Barack Obama would do. On November 14th of 2011, Trump tweeted Barack Obama. Now, keep in mind, this was just before the 2011 was the year before 2012, which was the year that Barack Obama was up for re-election. So in November, 1 year before the election, Trump tweets, Barack Obama will attack Iran in the not too distant future because it'll help him win the election. And then the following year, 2012, now the election year, Obama's up for re-election. He ran against Mitt Romney, as I recall. Here you've got, this is January of 2012, the election year, Trump tweeting, Barack Obama will attack in order to get reelected. And then in July 3rd, 2012, the day before the 4th of July, again, the election year, Donald Trump tweets, just as I predicted, Barack Obama is preparing a possible attack on Iran right before November. And then in August, the next month, August 16th, 2012, Donald Trump tweets, I always said Barack Obama will attack Iran in some form prior to the election. And then on October 9th, 2012, Donald Trump tweets, now that Obama's poll numbers are in a tailspin, watch for him to launch a strike in Libya or Iran. He is desperate. So clearly this is how this man thinks. He has been telling us this since 2011. Meanwhile, a whole bunch of really bad news for Donald Trump has happened in the last 24 hours, most of which is absolutely not making it up through the noise of, oh my God, what's going to happen in Iran? And it may well be that these things are happening because it may be that this attack happened because of these things coming out. For example, the memos between members of people in the White House and the Office of Management and Budget were leaked yesterday to a website, Just Security, that can absolutely confirm that everybody in OMB or everybody at the senior level, that what Mick Mulvaney said was right. Yes, we withheld aid from Ukraine because we wanted them to investigate Joe Biden. And now it's here in black and white. The smoking gun, or another smoking gun, that should lead to his impeachment, number one. Number two, Congressman Ted Lieu and Congresswoman Kathleen Rice of California and New York, respectively, have opened an investigation into Donald Trump or some of the people around him and his family members openly manipulating futures on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. Number three, and this is probably the big one. This is probably the one that Trump really doesn't want us to pay attention to. Mark Sumner summarizes it over at Daily Kos with a headline that just kind of summarizes the whole thing. Explosive report indicates that Donald Trump's loans from Deutsche Bank were backed by Russia. Mark Sumner writes, when Trump first went to Deutsche Bank, he was more than broke. Now just consider this for a minute. What bank is going to loan to this guy? He had just finished bankrupting multiple casinos in New Jersey and then had convinced investors to back a takeover of those casinos at a fraction of the original value. So he went out to a bunch of people and said, give me your money, I'm going to buy back my own casinos from bankruptcy. He gets all this investor money, and then Trump deliberately allowed the investment group to go bankrupt so he could grab the whole deal himself at a fraction of what his investor had paid for. So he ends up with the property, and then he goes bankrupt again after he sucks out of it whatever he can suck out, including all his investors' money. And along the way, he was back to Mark's Sumner's comments. And along the way, he was socked with a massive fine for money laundering at his now bankrupt again casino. I mean, he was totally radioactive. No bank in America would loan him money, and he was broke. And Deutsche Bank loaned him $2 billion. And to this day, nobody knows why. Well, now this explosive report comes out. It's again a whistleblower saying that, in fact, Trump's loans from Deutsche Bank were underwritten by a Russian state-owned bank, VTB Bank. And Russian state-owned means that basically, Vladimir Putin loaned him $2 billion. Suddenly, a lot of things start making sense. By the way, Sumner notes the documents supposedly originated with the son of a former Deutsche Bank official who committed suicide. So you've got all that going on. Now, this is all a great distraction from that kind of stuff for Donald Trump. Plus, Eric, on the day before New Year, on December 31st, New Year's Eve, Eric Trump tweets, "About to open a big old can of whoop-ass," and a flag. Right? What's that about? Somebody on Twitter said, "Oh, it's because the troops are getting on a plane to go to Iraq." Well, yeah, apparently. And there's thousands more on their way. Now, all that said, I think it's really important that we remember why all this is happening. And I'm not talking about anything that has to do with Donald Trump. We can never forget that Dick Cheney and George W. Bush lied us into a war in Iraq. They committed a crime against the American people, and then they committed war crimes against the government and the people of Iraq. Now, back in 1994, when Dick Cheney was a member of Congress, and he had been a chief of staff, I believe, to George Herbert Walker Bush. He had worked in the White House before that. In fact, he'd worked in the White House going all the way back to Nixon, as I recall. Dick Cheney was asked, now this was after the first Gulf War, right? So he was asked, well, should we have, and this is during the Bill Clinton presidency, by the way, and he was asked, should we have gone all the way to Baghdad? George Bush had his 100-hour war. It was a 3-day war, and he didn't go all the way to Baghdad. And so Dick Cheney was asked, well, shouldn't we have taken Baghdad? Listen to this carefully. This is a very thoughtful analysis, and it's absolutely accurate. This is Dick Cheney in 1994.
Do you think that the U.S. or UN forces should have moved into Baghdad?
No.
Why not?
Because if we'd gone to Baghdad, we would have been all alone. There wouldn't have been anybody else with us. It would have been a U.S. occupation of Iraq. None of the Arab forces that were willing to fight with us in Kuwait were willing to invade Iraq. Once you got to Iraq and took it over and took down Saddam Hussein's government, then what are you going to put in its place? That's a very volatile part of the world, and if you take down the central government in Iraq, you can easily end up seeing pieces of Iraq fly off. Part of it the Syrians would like to have to the west. Part of eastern Iraq the Iranians would like to claim, fought over for 8 years. In the north, you've got the Kurds, and if the Kurds spin loose and join with the Kurds in Turkey, then you threaten the territorial integrity of Turkey. It's a quagmire if you go that far and try to take over Iraq. The other thing was casualties. Everyone was impressed with the fact that we were able to do our job with as few casualties as we had. But for the 146 Americans killed in action and for their families, it wasn't a cheap war. And the question for the president in terms of whether or not we went on to Baghdad and took additional casualties in an effort to get Saddam Hussein was how many additional dead Americans is Saddam worth? And our judgment was not very many, and I think we got it right.
So that was Dick Cheney in 1994. And then Dick Cheney goes on Meet the Press and just basically, this is now, he has vice president. Dick Cheney is basically lying, saying, oh no, Saddam Hussein actually is in charge of the whole central terror network.
Here we're successful in Iraq. If we can stand up a good representative government in Iraq that secures the region so that it never, if we're successful in Iraq, pursuing weapons of mass destruction so that it's not a safe haven for terrorists.
And he continues.
We will have struck a major blow right at the heart of the base, if you will, the geographic base of the terrorists who've had us under assault now for many years, but most especially on 9/11.
Yeah, Saddam had 9/11, and he continues.
Sits on top of 10% of the world's oil reserves.
All right, let's just start that one again. And then this was in this 1994 Meet the Press interview. Then he adds,
Iraq sits on top of 10% of the world's oil reserves. Very significant reserve, second only to Saudi Arabia.
so we were lied into a war in Iraq, essentially to get the oil. Donald Trump is bragging about how he's keeping U.S. forces in northeastern Syria in the oil fields. The Iraqi oil fields, we've been, quote, protecting, as it were. Iraq and then Iran is the seventh largest producer of oil in the world. I mean, let's keep all this stuff in perspective, and let's not forget that had Cheney and Bush not lied us into this war in Iraq, we wouldn't have been in Iraq in the first place. If we weren't in Iraq in the first place, we wouldn't be in a war with Iran right now, or on the verge of one. So I just think it's really important that we put these things in historical context, and that we remember clearly how we got here. One Republican president lied us into a war, and now another Republican president is going to use that war to cover up his own crimes, his own sketchy financial history, the reason why he might be reaching out to oligarchs and foreign governments for help in his election. He's going to use that and to stop his own impeachment. I mean, this is what Republican presidents do. Nixon committed treason to become president. Ronald Reagan committed treason to become president, cutting a deal with Iran to hold the hostages. George W. Bush got in because his daddy's friends on the Supreme Court handed Florida to him, when later we found that Florida actually majority of Floridians voted for Al Gore. And then, Donald Trump gets into office with help from Russia, among others. Apparently the UAE and others, and Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, we literally have not had a legitimate Republican president in the United States elected legitimately since Dwight Eisenhower.